Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're at in the world. This is a mastering audio workshop, ending of listening with mastering engineer Conor Dalton. Conor has over 10 years of professional mastering experience with his company Glowcast Audio Mastering. He's worked on music with Daft Punk, Jeff Mills, Marcel Detman, Ricardo Villalobos, Carl Craig, John Digweed, Maceo Plex, Dax J, just to name a few. He's also one of the engineers at Calyx Mastering in Berlin, where his credits include Roadhog, Dubfire, Moderat, Scuba, Boys Noise, as well as a tutor at Berklee College of Music in Valencia, a tutor at DBS in Berlin, tutor at Subsign Academy in Glasgow, and a musician in the band Island People on the label Raster. He's the winner of the Sound Engineer of the Year 2012 from the Scottish New Music Awards. Conor is also a published writer in Music Tech magazine worldwide and has previously worked at the world famous Carvalho Mastering in Toronto. So without further ado, everyone, Conor Dalton.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for joining us, Conor.
Yes, my pleasure. It's nice to be here from rainy Berlin.
Hey, it's raining here too, man. I'm with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess it's going good, man.
6 a.m.
Yep. Yeah, it's early, man. It's 6:30, but we're here. So to get started, I guess just a general question: what is mastering?
Mastering comes at the end of the audio production process, and it's kind of the final check and the final chance you get to sonically enhance and change a piece of music before it goes to production. So it can involve EQ, compression, limiting, the same tools that you would use in mixing. But the rules are slightly different because in mastering, you're mostly dealing with one audio file rather than stems or rather than the individual elements of the song. So anything you do affects everything. So if you boost the low end, it will change how the high end reacts. If you compress the whole song, it will change the relationship between the drums and the singing. Yeah, mastering is the final stage before a song becomes a song. And I'm pretty happy that I'm dealing with musicians at the end of the chain. I think during the mixing process, so much is open to interpretation that when it gets to the mastering stage, the song is almost complete. So it feels, it suits my personality to work on music at that stage of the process rather than to have it so open-ended during the creation. But if you are mastering, the most two important things that I can tell you today is you need to do volume match comparisons between before and after processing. If you're not doing them volume matched comparison, then you are not mastering. You're just making something louder and you're not aware of the damage you're doing. And the second most important thing you can do when you're mastering is to reference other people's music in your genre at the same perceived volume as what you're working on. And maybe you're working on something and you quickly go and reference somebody else's song and theirs is louder than yours. You need to remove that volume discrepancy from the equation so that you can do a fair comparison. So between those two things, you can learn everything you need to learn to work on audio critically. And you can use perception to do that as well. Actually, you can use perception to do the volume match comparison between references and your material.
Very cool. So I've got a question here for you, Conor. What is the most important thing that people should know when it comes to listening?
Yeah, it's a good question, and the answer is kind of complicated. Hearing and listening are not the same thing. Hearing is passive, listening is active. If you really want to learn how to listen, you need to first be aware that you listen with your brain. You don't listen with your ears. I can remember well, let me think about that. I can remember that I did a month-long holiday And on that holiday, I was doing a kickboxing workshop. So for the month long, I was doing exercise 2 times a day, 6 days a week. And then when I came back to work, I was working a lot better than I was before. And I was getting less revision requests and so on. And it led me to trying to figure out why that was, like why my tools were exactly the same, my ears were the same, but something had changed. And it led me into sort of thinking about what listening is. And you need to be relaxed when you listen. You need to be feeling good, you need to be healthy, and you need to be focused. And I think what the boxing taught me was how to focus a bit better. So, you know, if you are doing some extreme sport like that, you've no choice but to focus and be in the present. And I think I took that with me a bit. And your brain is like a mathematical priority machine. You can only really focus on 3 things at once, and the rest is in your subconscious. And I think it was a David Lynch quote, and he said, your focus is the size of a tennis ball and your subconscious is the size of an ocean. And I quite like that. I think it's quite reflective of what sound is. And like, if you put your focus on something, sometimes you don't see the bigger picture. So it's a kind of battle between being laser focused on a minute detail and then zooming out and seeing the bigger picture. And you need to jump between the two as a mastering engineer or as a sound engineer. It's not healthy to get too attached to a minuscule detail and lose sight of the bigger picture. And it's not healthy to only see the bigger picture and ignore the details. So I think, yeah, the thing with audio, recorded audio, is that it's really, really new technology for our species. It's only been around for a few decades, and we don't quite know what to do with it yet. So it's made us really intrigued and really interested by it. But don't forget that audio is literally a slice of frozen time. So we've captured time, and you can return back to the beginning and back to the beginning and back to the beginning. So your ear finds that incredibly fascinating at the start. Your ear really wants to understand why this time is looping. And there's nothing in nature that repeats over and over again identically. Like, there's no 2 trees that are the same. But when we have a piece of recorded music, it repeats identically each time we play it. And you need to be quite aware of that as a sound engineer. I think it's really, really, really important to realize what happens if you expose yourself to this looped frozen time over and over again. Your body will start to reject it and attack it and treat it like something that's unnatural, because it is unnatural for our DNA. Like, it's new technology in the grand scheme of our makeup as humans. So, I mean, you might have even had this experience where you are working on a song for, let's say you're working on a song for 8 hours. The first 2 hours, you love it. You think the bass line sounds amazing. You're really happy about how everything's going. You don't see any problems with the audio. Fast forward another 2 or 3 hours, you hate the bass line all of a sudden. You think the drums sound dull. You start to attack the song because your brain is desperate for stimulation. It's desperate for time to become unfrozen. So it starts to see the song as a threat. And what happens then is your brain starts to release cortisol. And when cortisol comes into your focus, you cannot make good decisions because you want to fight or flight. You want to punch the computer. You want to run away. And I think it's really, really, really important to be aware of this early in your career as a sound engineer, because your ego will want you to sit in your chair until the song sounds good. Your ego wants you to stay in the room. Your body wants you to run. And you can change this, and you can use it to your advantage, and you can work with it simply by using reference tracks to allow time to unfreeze for a second, or saving the project, working on something else. And as soon as you press play on something else, your brain and your body will say, oh, thank you. Like you'll feel it in your bones, you'll feel it in your blood. Your body will be grateful that time is unfrozen. So you need to override your ego constantly as a sound engineer. You need to allow for the fact that your body will begin to get stressed if you freeze time and get stuck on a loop. And you need to work with that. So when you're mastering, the best thing to do is, well, not the best thing to do. A technique that I use or I like to use if I can is I'll work on the song for a 10-minute burst and then I'll go away and I'll work on something else and I'll come back to the song maybe in 2 or 3 hours and, you know, keep skipping between the audio that I'm working on. And there's multiple reasons for that. As a listener, you never listen to the same song 10 times in a row. You listen to a song once, and then you listen to another song. As a sound engineer, you'll listen to the song 10 times in a row. So maybe your 10th impression is not as sensible as your first or second impression. So in order to counteract that, maybe it's best if you split up the process into multiple days and expose yourself to multiple first impressions rather than get stuck in a loop of frozen time. And then you have, I don't know if you've ever spent way too long on a song. Most of you probably have. And when you press play, you have no idea what to do. You don't know if you should turn the hi-hat up by 12 dB or turn the hi-hat down by 12 dB. Nothing makes sense anymore. Your brain has consumed that piece of audio to the point that it's now locked. It can't change without stressing you out. It can't be anything else. It's hardened. And your brain has taken a song, which is chaos, which is constant moving frequencies, and it's just solidified it into a thing, and it can't see outside the box anymore. So my suggestion is take breaks, use reference tracks to unfreeze time, and listen to your body. As soon as you start to feel like you're getting stressed, save the project, go away, go for a walk, do something else, have a cup of coffee. And I mean, all through my audio engineering career, people would say, "Oh yeah, take breaks," but I don't think it's been really explained why you need to take breaks. I've never heard anyone really explain why you should take breaks in a way that makes total sense. And I think you cannot work with audio unless you're aware of your stress levels. If you are stressed, don't make critical decisions.
Man, that is an amazing insight that you shared with us, Connor. And in the chat, people seem to really be enjoying your philosophy behind mastering. So with that in mind, with the idea of keeping a balance and keeping your ears fresh and having a good first, impression on a song when you're mastering, what is your approach when you actually sit down to master a song?
Every piece of audio is different. The mastering process is a very similar process. Usually there's nothing that crazy goes on with the tools. You're only ever dealing with amplitude, frequency, and phase. So you're only ever dealing with like EQ, compression, limiting, some colorful tools, maybe saturation, whatever. My approach is I like to deal with cleaning up the audio early in the chain, but that doesn't necessarily mean that cleaning up the audio is the first thing that I do. But in the chain, I try and do all my corrective EQ as early, pretty much first. So I will do dynamic EQ if I find resonances that happen once in a while. I will do static EQ, narrow cuts, if I find resonances that happen consistently. So clean up the audio first. Let's say if it needs some compression, then I'll do some compression. Maybe I'll have a few compressors in a row doing slightly different things. Maybe one of them is to catch peaks. Maybe one of them is to add some body. Maybe one of them is parallel compression to add some punch. It depends. Some songs will come to me heavily compressed and I'll not do any compression at all. But a rule that I have is I like to do anything that adds color later in the chain, because I don't want to add any harmonics to a signal that has problems in it. Multiband, maybe if a whole range is becoming problematic, say in the chorus, the whole high mid range becomes harsh, I could use multiband there just to tame the range and smooth things out. Yeah, every song's different, but the philosophy is more or less the same. It's to try and enhance every domain to the point that it can be pushed without introducing damage. And as a mastering engineer, you need to very, very carefully recognize whenever damage starts to occur. And when it does, then you relax and you retreat back to the comfort zone. Yeah.
Great. And then Connor, we got a question from John here. John asks, when applying static EQ cuts, do you rely on visual cues from the EQ plugin, or does it all come down to how it sounds through your monitors?
Well, if you're dealing with resonances, let's think about why you would deal with a resonance in the first place. It's because the note is dominant. So let's say it's a single frequency that's dominant. I don't really want dominant frequencies in the song. I want confident frequencies in the song. The definition of dominant is something that takes away space from other things. And I don't really think that's usually appropriate for music to have like one frequency stealing the space from the surrounding frequencies. So in order to find dominant frequencies, you can use analyzers if you don't have that good a listening environment. What I like to do is whistle the note. So if I hear something as resonant, I'll repeat it, I'll whistle it, because if I hear something, it doesn't exist yet. It's just chemicals in my head generating a noise that I can hear up here. But if I whistle it, then it becomes real. It's like something in the real world that I can return my brain to. So you can use an analyzer, use your eyes. You can whistle it and then sweep with a very narrow cue with the EQ until you get to the note that you're whistling.
That's great, Connor. Thank you so much. Are you down to take a couple more questions? We've got a bunch populating here.
Absolutely.
So we got some popular ones. I'm going to go in kind of order of, recent or date and popularity. So aside from looking for resonances the way that you just showed and kind of explained some of your philosophy behind, Joey wants to know, when you're cleaning up the audio, what are some of the other problems that you're looking for aside from, the resonances that you just discussed?
Dips in the frequency domain. Some frequencies might have been neglected in general. It's a good question. It's a balance of everything. I'm trying to make sure that the intricate, delicate details of the song aren't lost because they're being bullied by the loud, obnoxious elements of the song. So I'm trying to make sure all the emotions in the song can be felt as part of the experience, and the quiet things aren't lost in the noise. I'm looking for a reasonably flat frequency balance. So I don't want one frequency range really, really high in amplitude and others really low. Like I don't want to have a complete lack of low mid range or something like that. So with EQ, I'm trying to balance the playing field. I don't want to have too much low end rumble wide. There's no real need for that. Clubs can't recreate it. So I want to have the sub strong down the center in the mono. I'm also trying to make sure the song is mono compatible so that things don't get lost because they've been panned too wide. Sibilance on a voice. Microphones find it hard to pick up S noises from a singer. So they can sound quite harsh on a vocal recording. So I'm paying attention to that to see if I can clean it up a bit.
And then for someone who's taking some of this advice into consideration, Connor, you said that you try to not have any one frequency range be like too pokey in the mix or the master. So if someone's starting to like pay attention to this more methodically, is there some kind of slope that you generally see in relationship from the low frequencies to high frequencies, or are people trying to aim for more or less white noise kind of flat across the top?
It would be pink noise that you're referring to, because pink noise includes the lower octaves, but it depends. It's a good question. Usually in electronic music, the low end is slightly over exaggerated because it's nice to have that feeling of being overpowered by the low end, but not so it becomes muddy. But the low end is usually slightly hyped in techno or drum and bass or so on. Yeah, it doesn't have to be perfectly visibly flat. You shouldn't try and aim for perfection. It just needs to feel right. It needs to feel powerful in each octave, so that there's nothing being neglected and nothing dominating the other octaves, so that they become an afterthought rather than equal with the rest of the band, you know. So if you try and picture it like a sound stage with musicians on stage, and you want all the musicians to feel part of the experience, and there's not one musician at the back shy, hiding. And yeah, it's a tricky one. It just needs to feel right, and it's a hard thing to explain feel. I think it's just based on a lot of referencing and a lot of experimentation at a volume match level, so that you can decide if you've improved it or not. Yeah, I guess that's my answer to that.
That's great. Okay, this one is the most upvoted question, and it comes from Carlos. And Carlos asks, can you explain the process of using more than one limiter in a chain? And then Carlos said, when you said that, Connor, you said that when you add coloration or some harmonic distortion, it's better to do that at the end, like before, like limiting or compression. But not too hot signals are recommended for the input of this type of processing. How do you manage that level? So I guess in short, if you're using more than one limiter, in addition to harmonic excitement, what point do you do these stages of the process?
So I'm feeding usually my audio through my chain at a reasonably low level. So I would usually use normalization at the start to turn the pre-master down to the volume that I'm comfortable with, so that I have loads of headroom to work. Using two limiters, if you're going to do that, I would recommend using firstly a multiband limiter and secondly a broadband limiter. So the multiband limiter will be doing its heavy limiting, but only on the frequency ranges that are higher in amplitude than you want them to be. So for example, if the low mid-range, let's say there's a tom drum in the low mid-range that's really loud, the multiband limiter will just limit the low mid-range. So now the problem is controlled. So now it goes to the second limiter, and that can do the heavy lifting. And the second limiter won't have to worry so much about that troublemaker tom, because it's been dealt with slightly earlier. So what that means is the second limiter doesn't have to limit so hard. So if you're going to use two limiters, I would highly recommend you use a multiband limiter and then a proper broadband limiter after that. Yeah, you can also use two broadband limiters in a row because they have slightly different flavors, but it's less advisable, I would say. You've got a bunch of good options for the multiband limiting too. There's a lot of really cool plugins out there that do do that very well. And also, I would suggest that you don't let the limiter do too much heavy lifting. I think if you need to dynamically process the song harder, it's probably better to use more compressors than to use extreme limiting, because limiting focuses on the peaks, compression focuses on the body, more or less. And you don't want to smash the peaks too much, because it can just take away the power and take away the punch, especially if it's drum heavy music like electronic music or something dance floor orientated.
Very cool. So we've got about 15 minutes left, Connor. Do you want to field a couple more questions, or did you have something else that you wanted to?
I mean, I'm totally happy to answer questions. It's a shame we've got such a short amount of time. Let's go for the questions and then.
Okay. I think so. Before I go on to Brigitte's question, OnKits is somewhat related to what you were just talking about, but rather than just talking about limiters, his question is in regards to compressors. So OnKit asks, what defines the choice of compressor in your mastering chain, particularly the choice between a transparent compressor and a compressor with more color/flavor?
If I really like what's there, then I'll use a transparent compressor. If I want to add something or enhance what's there, then I'll use something with more color. But I won't rely on one processor to inject all the color. I'll use multiple processors that give a little tiny bit of color, so they all add up in a way that you're just slightly like manipulating the seesaw of the song until it sort of gets to the end and in a way that you're happy with. So I think if you feel that the song already has a lot of character, then go for transparent. But if the song feels a bit cold or a bit digital or a bit clean, then it's okay to rough it up a little bit, but not too much. I don't think it's appropriate to radically change the song during mastering. And that's just my philosophy. I always try and aim for a sort of transparent processing as much as possible. Your job, I think the song is a story, and your job as the engineer is to help the story be understood through editing, in a way, like through helping the story be more articulate. But the story is always the story, and you shouldn't add things to the story, is my philosophy when it comes to mastering. You shouldn't write a new chapter. You should just help the story express itself.
Great.
Yeah.
That's awesome, man. Thank you. All right. So Brigitte asks, do you ever run into distortion issues when you play a master back on, say, an iPhone or smartphone or computer speakers? And how would you go about addressing this?
I wonder where you're playing it back from, because playing it back from different sources will have totally different results. Streaming platforms normalize music. Apart from SoundCloud, it doesn't. Instagram, I think they've fixed this recently, but Instagram used to sum to mono and add about 2 dB of gain. So Instagram would distort music more often than not for some bizarre reason. If you're making a master specifically for streaming websites, you need a little bit more headroom on the output of the limiter than you would if you were making a master for a CD. So if you're making a master for streaming platforms like Spotify and YouTube, it's always good to have the ceiling of the limiter at about -1. So that should help to avoid distortion on those places. But it's a moving target. These websites have changed their request quite a lot over the past few years, so it's not always so clear what they're looking for. But yeah, if in doubt, aim for more dynamic and leave a little bit more headroom. If you recognize that your music is distorting on multiple websites, then that's your problem. Yeah, the loudness war is changing. I think you don't really win by trying to make your song the loudest song in the room anymore. I think it's better to allow some dynamics and some breathing space, and that can help. That seems to be favorable.
Ian Shepherd is jumping for joy, I'm sure.
Yes, exactly. That's a good
All right.
resource, by the way. I'm glad you mentioned him. Ian Shepherd is a guy who does a podcast on SoundCloud called The Mastering Show. And if you're interested in mastering, Ian has covered in detail pretty much any specific topic within mastering that you could imagine. So I really recommend checking everything out that he's up to. He's a library of mastering knowledge.
Yeah, I went down a rabbit hole of his ebooks and podcasts and stuff years ago. He's great. All right, so got about 10 more minutes-ish. You want to take, we got 2 more questions in the chat. You want to take those and then we'll kind of wrap things up?
Cool. Yeah.
Okay. So Rahul asks, how do you manage mastering a track with a very large dynamic range?
First, I would ask the musician, is that their intention? Do they want to keep the dynamics, or did they just assume that mastering would make the song really fat without them doing any compression and dynamic control in the mix? So it's better to check that early, to ask, do you want this to be a dynamic track? And if they say, no, I want it to be super fat, then you might want to suggest they revisit the mix and add some more compression. If you can't get the mix changed and they do want it to be super loud, even though they've given you something super dynamic, then you have no choice but to go extreme with the processing, and that's going to introduce some artifacts. But so be it. That's the problem you're faced with if you are presented with that situation. So you could do clipping to chop off a couple of dB on the tops of the peaks that are just stray peaks that don't really have any musical impact. Just be careful of distortion. We have to do quite a lot of compression, and you might have to do quite heavy limiting. But it's really important to try get the frequency balance as balanced as possible, because that just means that the dynamic processors don't have to work so hard. But it's tricky. It's tricky to take a very dynamic mix and make it a super loud mix, but I also don't think it's that desirable to do that, to take something super dynamic and squash it. But that's up to the musician, really. If that's what they're going for, then I would, it's worth trying. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, man. That's great. All right, another question we have here from David. He says, can you refresh our minds when using linear phase, zero latency, or natural phase within EQ plugins?
It's a bit of a longer answer, but I'll tell you the best video on YouTube about how you can really get to the bottom of that, and it's by a guy called Dan Worrell, and he did a minimum phase versus linear phase tutorial using the FabFilter Pro Q, and it's amazing. It'll take a few watches to really figure out what he's talking about, because he goes really into depth. Here is another link that I'm going to paste in the chat that's also very, very useful. Is that it? Yep. So neither minimum phase or linear phase is without consequences. If you do minimum phase EQ, then you're going to get a phase shift. If you do linear phase EQ, then you're going to get pre-ringing. The pre-ringing can occur on transients. So what might happen is, if you do some extreme narrow low mid-range cut with a linear phase EQ on a snare drum, pre-ringing might sound like this. The original snare drum sounds like, and with the linear phase EQ, it might sound like this. There might be an event that happens before the transient. So you need to be very careful with linear phase EQ if you're doing narrow cuts lower down in the frequency domain. you need to look out for pre-ringing, because it can be quite a strange artifact to add into a song. One of them isn't better than the other. They just are different. Linear phase is good at protecting the transients in the higher octaves. Yeah. It depends what you're looking for. All analog EQs are minimum phase. Linear phase doesn't exist in the analog domain. Yeah, it's a tricky one. It's really something you need to experiment with before you figure out what works for you in what scenario and what situation. Just be aware that minimum phase EQ will slightly shift the phase, and linear phase EQ has the risk of pre-ringing. And yeah, there's a lot to learn about that, which we unfortunately probably won't have time for today, because it's a 2 or 3 hour conversation in itself, really.
Yeah, and I remember you showing us that example, and I was one of the first times I really clearly heard, what pre-ringing does, especially to transients, as you mentioned. All right, well, I'm told from Gio here, our technical director, we've got about 3 minutes left. So if you have any closing thoughts, Connor, or perhaps you could share with people who are interested in getting into mastering. Maximilian, I saw your question, but unfortunately it's not directly related to mastering. So I'm sorry, but I don't think we'll be able to get to that. That's more of a engineering, recording, mixing question. So for folks who are looking at getting into mastering right now, do you think it's more important that they have specific gear, or they understand concepts? Can people do this in their homes? What's your final advice for folks who want to get into mastering?
Gear is not important. What's important is how you think, how you hear with your brain, and how you feel about audio. Your decisions are way more important than what equipment you own. If you want to try analog, go and try for yourself. There's a website called Access Analog, and you can use analog equipment from their warehouse in your project, in your studio, through the cloud. So try it for yourself, and you'll soon see that just having access to analog equipment won't solve all your problems. My advice would be, don't let your desires for high standards hold you hostage. If you want to master music, you can start in your bedroom. Just be prepared that you're probably going to suck. You're not probably going to be very good at it for a long time. And you need to be comfortable and okay with that. If you want to become a master at something, you have to first be completely okay with being a fool. You have to first completely accept that you're going to make massive mistakes, and you're going to start by doing it badly. But don't be afraid of that, and don't let that slow you down. Like, it's not healthy to be stressed out about not being at the point that you want to be at. Just try, jump in, and just experiment, and volume match comparisons to before and after, and you'll soon improve. And if you're working on yourself a little bit every day, let's say if you get like 0.2% better every day at sound engineering, by the end of the year you're 73% better than you were at the start of the year. So I would say, don't be competitive with other people. Be competitive with yourself. Try and be better at sound engineering than you were last week. And always, every day, try and learn at least something small. And nobody is born naturally good at sound engineering. It's not about what shape your ear is, about having good hearing. It's nothing to do with that. It's about practice and persistence and repetition and volume match comparisons and experimentation and patience. Be patient, be kind to yourself. Don't allow the stress to stop you from moving forwards. And I think success with sound engineering is basically walking from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. So I think it's all there. Like, nobody's born naturally good at EQing. It's a matter of repetition until you get good at it over time. So it's all about your decisions, and it's not about the equipment. The equipment helps. The equipment will make you faster at it and so on, but it's not how you get good at it. You get good at it by patience and persistence.
Well, that is fantastic, Conor. Unfortunately, I think we're out of time here for the day. But I really want to thank you for your time and your invaluable insight. I know everyone in the chat seems to appreciate your time and your insight. So thank you so much, everyone. Show some love for Conor. And
thank you all so much. Thank you. That was super nice. Nice to chat to you. It's a shame to load it all into such a small window of 1 hour. It's really hard to cover things in depth, but yeah, thank you for having me. It's been super nice.
No problem. Thanks for being here, Conor.
My pleasure.
Thank you all for being here as well.